She was paid to plan his wedding, but the groom was the man who shattered her heart. She didn't want the job, not because the budget wasn't breathtaking. It was. Not because the venue was impossible. It wasn't. Not even because the client was difficult. He was, but she could handle difficult. She didn't want the job because of the name, Matthew Rains. But after 3 months of silence in her inbox, after 22 declined proposals, after quietly surviving a year of closing doors and bills she never thought she'd have to care about again, one of her assistants accepted the contract without checking. And by the time she opened the file, it was too late. The deposit had cleared. The deadline was brutal. The bride's schedule was already in motion. So now she stood in the middle of a private vineyard estate in Northern California, clipboard in hand, heels sinking into damp grass, rehearsing her own composure like it was part of the decor. "You okay, Lila?" her assistant whispered beside her. Lila Hart didn't look up. She adjusted her sunglasses, brushed a stray hair behind her ear, smiled at the estate manager. "Perfectly fine," she said, because that's what professionals said when they were about to walk back into a man's life who hadn't seen them in 14 years. The bride-to-be was exactly what she expected. Tall, blonde, impossibly symmetrical. The kind of beauty that didn't have to try, because money smoothed the effort into elegance. Her name was Sabrina Vale, an actress turned wellness entrepreneur turned heiress by marriage in exactly 6 weeks. And when she walked in that morning for the second walkthrough, she greeted Lila with a cheerful, "Thank you again for fitting us in. I hear you're the best." She said with a soft tone, no venom, no suspicion, which somehow made it worse. "Happy to help," Lila said, voice even. "Matthew's very picky," Sabrina added, "but he trusts your taste." Lila's breath caught, just for a second. She hoped Sabrina didn't notice. He arrived late. Of course he did. 12 minutes after the meeting began, while she was discussing florals with a vendor rep, she felt it, that familiar shift in the air, the unspoken silence that followed some men into a room, not because they asked for it, but because the world gave it to them anyway. She didn't turn, not right away, but she knew. "Sorry I'm late," he said. That voice, sharper now, deeper, polished in places it used to be raw. Lila turned slowly. Matthew Rain stood in the entrance of the tasting room, buttoning his navy coat, no tie, sleeves rolled slightly like he hadn't been rushed, just reluctantly summoned. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, nothing else in the room moved. Not the assistant reaching for champagne samples. Not Sabrina flipping through linens. Not even Lila herself. Because the last time she'd seen that face, it hadn't been on a client. It had been on the only man who ever left without giving her a reason. And now, he was marrying someone else. She made it through the walkthrough, through the sample cake tasting, through Sabrina's casual mention of a destination honeymoon in Amalfi and Matthew's noncommittal nods. She made it through all of it, until the final question. "Do you have a theme in mind?" Lila asked. Sabrina lit up. "Something classic," she said. "Warm tones. Fort Vineyard palette." Then she looked at Matthew. "What do you think?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at Lila. "Longer than necessary. Whatever she thinks is best," he said quietly. And Lila felt it, not in the words, but in the silence between them. The silence that screamed, "You remember, don't you?" By the third day, Lila Hart had mastered avoidance like it was part of the decor. She scheduled vendor walkthroughs before breakfast. Tastings only when Matthew was away. She reviewed lighting grids by moonlight and hid her real reactions behind linen samples and battery-operated lanterns. And for the most part, it worked. Every time his name hit her inbox, she filtered it into a folder marked follow-up, late. Every time Sabrina mentioned him, a soft smile, a casual "he's so detail-oriented," Lila responded with a nod. Never too warm, never too cold, just enough to pass. Because the worst part wasn't seeing him. It was remembering how easy it had been to love him, and how much harder it was now to pretend she hadn't. The piano wasn't part of the original plan. No line item, no invoice, no mention in the master spreadsheet she updated every night before bed. So when the estate manager rolled a vintage baby grand across the back patio during a routine inspection, she froze. "Did the bride request this?" she asked. The manager, a man too tired to lie, shook his head. No, groom. She wanted to laugh, or scream, or say something clever and detached. Instead, she stood still, clipboard in hand, throat closing. And then she heard it. Just a note. Then another. Slow, careful, raw in a way digital recordings never were. She knew that sound. She knew that tempo. She knew what came next before the third chord hit. Because once, years ago, it had been hers. She rounded the corner, half in shadow, half exposed by sunlight streaming through the vineyard. And there he was, Matthew Rains, sitting alone at the piano like it still belonged to him. His jacket was off, sleeves rolled up, shoulders hunched just slightly like the weight of the music required more than bone and breath to carry it. He didn't see her, but he played like he did. The notes wrapped around her spine, threaded through memory, dragged up something she had buried in the back seat of a rented car in Montauk. The last place she ever said, "I love you" out loud. Her feet didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard. The rose trellis above her swayed, casting soft shadows across her blouse, as if even nature didn't dare interrupt. Then he looked up, met her eyes. No smile, no soak, just recognition, like he'd been waiting for her to appear. He finished the melody, every note falling quiet, as if he could measure time in silence. Then, in that voice, the one she'd forgotten how much she remembered, he said, "Still prefer cello covers?" Her heart pulled taut. She cleared her throat. "I don't remember," she replied, sharper than she intended. He tilted his head slightly. That's not true. And it wasn't, because she could still feel it. The way his hands had moved then, just like now. The way his silence said more than his words. "You don't get to do this, Matthew." He stood, slowly, the piano behind him like a ghost. "Do what?" "Look at me like I'm still a question you haven't answered." He took a step forward. "Maybe you are." She laughed once. Bitter. Tired. "You're engaged." He didn't flinch. "And you're here." And just like that, the air changed. It stretched between them, full of things they never got to say. And then it broke. Lila, Sabrina's voice, light as glass. She appeared from the side garden, holding her phone, smiling, radiant. "Do you have a second to look at the RSVP tracker? I think the system's glitching." Lila blinked once, twice, then turned. A smile bloomed across her lips like muscle memory. Of course. She walked past Matthew like he was scenery, like she hadn't just broken in real time. And as she disappeared down the stone path, clipboard tucked against her ribs like a shield, she felt his eyes on her back. Still watching, still silent, still playing a song she'd spent 14 years trying to forget. And the silence it left behind was still burning a hole through her. There was a rhythm to the way she avoided him. She planned it like a symphony. Vendor walkthroughs early, tastings when he was out, final floral discussions with Sabrina only. Every time his name hit her inbox, she filtered it into a separate folder, one she refused to open until after midnight, when the world was quiet and she could read without feeling. She told herself it was control, professionalism, but really, it was fear. Because every second she spent near Matthew Rains chipped something off the wall she'd spent 14 years building. He wasn't supposed to still sound like that. He wasn't supposed to still look at her like that. And he definitely wasn't supposed to still know what song made her forget how to breathe. It happened on a Tuesday, a delivery morning. Light rain on the vineyard roads, the smell of wet earth thick in the air. Lila had her hair pinned, her blazer slightly damp from unloading hydrangea samples too close to the fountain. "You got something," her assistant said, dropping a slim white envelope on the desk beside her laptop. "Who from?" "No sender. Just this." The handwriting was neat, slightly slanted, block letters, but soft, the kind used by someone trying not to be recognized. "Lila Hart." She stared at it for a long moment. Her fingers didn't want to touch it. Her heart already knew it wasn't a vendor. It wasn't a client. It was personal. She opened it. The first line punched her breath from her lungs. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I'm writing anyway." She had to sit down, not because she was tired, but because her legs wouldn't work. It was dated May 17th, 13 years ago, nearly a year after he disappeared without warning, after Venice, after their last trip, when she'd asked him if he was serious about forever, and he had said yes. For pages, handwritten, folded perfectly. At the top, faint and faded, was the gold crest of the Belvedere Hotel. She remembered it instantly. The wine-colored bedding, the flickering sconce above the fireplace, the way Matthew had played with her hair as she read out loud from a menu in fake Italian. She remembered asking him why he was so quiet that weekend. He'd said he was tired. She hadn't believed him then. Now she knew. They gave me a choice, the letter said. The company or you. I didn't know how to fight them. And by the time I figured it out, it was too late. I thought I could fix it fast. I thought I could come back before it hurt. I didn't know how long forever was until I walked away from you. You deserved more than a letter. But it's all I have left. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't romantic. It was raw. And something about that made it even more real. Lila stared at the page. She could hear her own breath, the clock ticking, the sound of her assistant typing in the other room. But nothing registered. She turned the letter over, looking for more, an email, a number, anything. Instead, just a name, Matthew James Raines, signed in the same quiet ink. She didn't cry, not yet, but her mind raced through every missed moment. The trip she canceled, the job she took out of spite, the time her friend told her he never loved you. Otherwise, he'd still be here. And how she believed it, how she'd forced herself to believe it. Until now, and then it hit her. She had seen this envelope before. Not this exact one, but another, same shape, same weight, in a pile of unopened packages when she'd moved offices 4 years ago. Her old assistant had tossed it in a box marked vendor samples. She'd almost opened it. Almost. But then a client called, and she'd forgotten. It had probably gone into the shred pile. Her stomach dropped. By midnight, the estate was silent. She sat in the small planter's office with the letter in her lap, lights dimmed, wine untouched. The vineyard outside glowed, faint under silver moonlight. She should have called him, texted, something, but her fingers wouldn't type, because some truths didn't open wounds. They ripped out the stitching she'd spent years pretending held. She folded the letter, pressed it against her chest, and for the first time in 14 years, she allowed herself to whisper his name. Matthew. The rehearsal dinner was flawless. Catered, plated, bathed in late afternoon gold. Every surface of the Raines vineyard glowed like a wedding magazine cover. Flickering candles, polished glassware, curated laughter. The kind of atmosphere that costs more than some people's homes and still managed to feel effortless. Lila stood near the perimeter of the main terrace, headset in one ear, smiling through polite nods and wine refills. Her clipboard was tucked beneath her arm. She didn't need it anymore. Every second of this dinner had been memorized, pre-checked, confirmed, and reconfirmed. The servers were on pace. The toasts were staggered perfectly. Sabrina had changed into a white silk slip gown that looked like it had been sewn directly onto her body, and Matthew hadn't looked at her once. Not directly, but she felt it, the weight of it, every time he moved. It wasn't longing. It wasn't regret. It was recognition. And maybe something else she hadn't let herself name yet. She slipped away just before dessert. No one noticed, because she moved like a shadow, precisely when the third toast began, when the soft laughter had risen, when Sabrina's father raised his glass and said the words to a forever kind of love. Lila didn't need to hear that line again. She'd heard it before, from someone else, in a different suit, under different stars. The estate office was locked, but she had the key. Technically, it was still hers for the next 48 hours. She told herself she was just checking floral invoices, that something had glitched in the RSVP list, that it had nothing to do with the letter now folded in the lining of her planner. But as she sat at the small mahogany desk and opened the bride's event folder, her fingers didn't stop at flowers. They moved to the contracts. And then the NDA. It was signed 8 months ago, by Sabrina. Not unusual. Some families did prenups quietly, even with planners involved. But this one wasn't just a prenup. It was a partnership agreement. Shares, voting rights, conditional trusts, and a clause Lila hadn't seen before. Not in any other wedding she'd managed. Not even among the wealthiest. A clause that detailed silence. About a previous relationship. one predating the engagement, one that, if revealed, would cause reputational damage to the bride. Lila stared at the line, reread it, and something twisted in her stomach. She flipped to the amendment. The handwriting wasn't Sabrina's. It wasn't Matthew's either. It was someone else, someone familiar, someone she hadn't thought about in years. The name at the bottom? Eliot Vali, Sabrina's older brother, and the man who a decade ago had tried and failed to buy out Matthew Rain's startup before it went public. Lila sat back in the chair, blood humming in her ears. This wasn't a wedding. It was a transaction. And Matthew? Matthew didn't just vanish from her life for a company. He vanished into a deal. One he may not have written, but one he was now bound to. Just like before, she closed the folder slowly. Her fingers shook, and for the first time since she arrived at this estate, she wasn't sure who the real bride was anymore, or who this wedding was supposed to bury. She hadn't planned to return to the dinner. Not after what she'd read. Not after seeing Elliot Vale's signature. The man who once offered Matthew a 7-figure buyout and got turned down with nothing but a handshake and a threat. Now his sister was marrying Matthew? Lila knew the scent of power when it walked into a room dressed as love. And this wasn't romance. It was debt, dressed in silk and champagne. But still, she returned. Because she had to. Because she wasn't a woman who left unfinished events. Or unfinished pain. The guest had shifted from formal to flushed. The kind of wine-drunk energy that made billionaires laugh too loudly and their wives start removing shoes under the table. The sun was gone now, stars bleeding over the vineyard hills, fairy lights blinking in amber loops overhead. Lila stood at the bar, half hidden by a floral arch, sipping sparkling water from stemless glass just to keep her hands busy. That's when Sabrina stood and clinked her fork against her glass. A light ring. Laughter. Attention. I know the bride isn't supposed to give a speech, Sabrina said, smiling too brightly. But I want to say something before we all forget what sobriety feels like. Polite laughter. Lila's shoulders tensed. Matthew didn't smile. He just watched her. Sabrina turned toward him. When I met Matthew, I was rebuilding. I just lost my father. I didn't believe in soulmates anymore. And then he showed up, completely unannounced, with a check I hadn't asked for, and a 3-paragraph letter I never expected. Lila blinked. A letter? He told me he knew what it meant to love someone you couldn't keep, and that he didn't want to make that mistake again. The crowd sighed. A collective awe rose through the tables. But Lila felt like the ground tilted. Her hand tightened on glass. She remembered that phrase, that exact line. He'd written it once, but not to Sabrina, to her, 14 years ago, in a letter she'd thought she never received. Her chest burned. Matthew still hadn't moved, but he looked at her now, fully. No vid, no regret, just a kind of tragic stillness, like a man watching a bridge he once set fire to from the wrong side. The applause faded. The servers returned. Cakes rolled out, and that's when it happened. Lila turned to step back behind the bar wall and collided with him. Matthew, not planned, not choreographed, just two ghosts brushing into each other with too much air between them. He steadied her by the elbow, too gently. That line, she said quietly, eyes never meeting his. I wrote it for you, he whispered. I just never got to send it. Her throat closed. But she got it. Not for me. Don't lie, Matthew. I'm not. She finally looked at him, and what she saw wasn't defense. It was sorrow. The kind that doesn't ask to be forgiven because it knows it doesn't deserve to be. Do you still have it? He asked after a long silence. What? The letter. Her fingers brushed the lining of her blazer. She didn't answer. Lila, you're marrying someone else. I know. Then why are you looking at me like that? He exhaled slow, shattered, because I never stopped. The vineyard was still asleep when Lila woke. She hadn't planned to. She'd barely closed her eyes, but her body jolted upright before dawn like it had remembered something she couldn't afford to forget. Her silk blouse from a night before was crumpled on the edge of the chair. The letter Matthew never meant her to find was still tucked under the mattress. Her phone, untouched, lit up with unread messages from vendors confirming deliveries she no longer cared about. She wasn't thinking about seating charts. She was thinking about the NDA and the signature, Eliot Vali. It had to be a coincidence. Had to be. But deep down, she knew better. Elliot wasn't just Sabrina's older brother. He was also a venture capitalist with a reputation for predatory takeovers and pristine public optics. And 14 years ago, he'd set his sights on a young startup founder with too much talent and too little protection. Matthew. And now Matthew was marrying into his family? On paper, it looked like romance. But the deeper she thought about it, the more it smelled like leverage. She showered fast, dressed faster, pulled her hair into a knot, and left the estate house before anyone else had even turned on a light. At 9:14 a.m., her assistant appeared beside her at the reception tent. "There's someone here asking for you," she whispered. "Says he worked for Rain's Capital. Wouldn't leave his name." Lila frowned. "What does he want?" "Said you'd understand once he handed you this." She handed over an envelope. "No name. Just wait." Old school, thick, heavy paper. Inside was a printed memo, half blackout redacted. But what was left was enough. Acquisition proposal. Vale Wellness Group plus Rain's Capital Holdings. Projected timeline. 13 months post-marriage finalization. Initial assets under shared trust, pending merger clause. There it was. Legal proof. This wasn't a wedding. It was a power move. A hostile acquisition dressed in vows and veuve cliquot. Her stomach turned. She met the man just outside the greenhouse. He looked like someone who'd been important once. Neat but weathered. Shoes worn. Coat buttoned too high like he didn't trust the wind. "You work with Matthew?" she asked cautiously. Before it became this, he nodded toward the estate. Back when it was still about ideas, not optics. He paused, then said, with a weighted breath, "I know who you are, and I know what they did to you." Her throat tightened. "Why now?" "Because I watched that boy sell everything but his soul. And I think they're asking him for that now, too. And you think I can stop it?" "I think you're the only one he'd still listen to." Back in the planning suite, Lila shut the door behind her, locked it, and sat at the edge of the small desk without turning on the light. The documents were spread in front of her now. The letter, the NDA, the acquisition terms, and her memory, sharper than it had been in years. Every thread of the past led back to one truth. She hadn't been forgotten. She'd been erased. Not by accident, not by miscommunication, by design. Because the wrong kind of love, a real one, an inconvenient one, was dangerous in rooms full of legacy contracts and bloodless billion-dollar deals. And she was tired of pretending she wasn't still standing in those rooms. She folded the memo, tucked it into her clutch, looked into the mirror, and didn't recognize the woman staring back. And for the first time in 14 years, that felt like a good thing. The vineyard had never looked more beautiful. Rows of white chairs framed the manicured aisle, flanked by rose petals hand-placed by florists flown in from Provence. Classical strings floated in the air, soft and intentional. The arbor at the altar was wrapped in gold-dusted ivy and woven orchids. Every guest shimmered. Designer dresses, polished cufflinks, decades of generational money captured in a curated sunset. It was the kind of wedding people whispered about for years. The kind where no one expected anything to go wrong. Because people like Sabrina Vale didn't do messy. They did legacy. They did control. They did forever, as long as the press stayed outside and the family lawyers stayed close. And yet, at the center of it all, Matthew Rain stood still. Too still. Not serene. Not grounded. Frozen. Lila saw it before anyone else did. The faint clench of his jaw, the way his left thumb tapped against his palm like he was counting breaths. It was the same look he wore when he used to pitch in boardrooms, just before he lied to a room of billionaires to save his company. And beside him, Sabrina looked perfect, effortlessly radiant in a silk slip gown designed to hug a body built for the cover of wedding magazines. Her skin glowed, her smile held, and her hands reached forward with practiced grace. But Matthew didn't take them. He barely looked at her. His eyes wandered, restless, somewhere else. And that somewhere was Lila. She was hidden behind a rose-covered partition, only 20 feet from the altar, close enough to hear the officiant's breath between sentences. She didn't wear anything dramatic, just a soft navy dress, a muted blazer, hair in a low knot. The look of a woman hired to be invisible. But she wasn't invisible anymore. Not to him, not to herself. The letter sat folded in her pocket, old, worn, truth-inked. The NDA contract waited silently in her inbox. The acquisition memo from Sabrina's brother, tucked inside a plain white envelope beside her clutch. She didn't know yet if she would say anything. But if she did, she would mean it. Every word. The officiant began. Soft tones. Poetic pacing. Sabrina glowed. She squeezed Matthew's hand and glanced at the crowd with a glossy, camera-ready smile. Lila stood still, unmoving, unblinking, waiting. Marriage is not only love, it is partnership. It is trust. It is legacy. That word, legacy. Lila's eyes narrowed. Matthew didn't flinch, but she could feel it. The shift, the tightening of the air. Love is not just a word, the officiant continued. It is a contract. That line cut, not because it was romantic, but because it was literal. Because this wasn't a wedding. It was a deal, a merger, a performance. Before we begin the vows, the officiant said, "If there is anyone here who objects." The audience chuckled lightly. They always did, because no one ever spoke up. Not at these kinds of weddings. Not in these kind of families. Not surrounded by money that polished pain into silence. Until now, Matthew stepped back. One step, then two. His shoulders dropped. His hands fell to his sides. Sabrina's smile faltered. She reached for him. Fast, desperate, not perfect anymore. He didn't take her hand. "I can't," he said softly. Gasps rippled down the rows of white chairs. Heads turned. Phones lifted. A mother gasped behind a tissue. A best man stood slowly, unsure if this was real. And from behind the flowers, Lila walked out. She moved slowly, not like a woman crashing a wedding. Like a woman who finally remembered she built half the love that stood on that altar and had been erased from its story. Every heel click echoed. Every breath held. Matthew saw her before anyone else did. He didn't blink, because he'd been waiting. "Is this a joke?" Sabrina's voice snapped across the altar. High, tight, breaking. "Is this a mistress stunt?" she hissed. Forgetting the guests, now fully leaned forward. Lila didn't respond. She kept walking until she reached the edge of the aisle. Then, calm, measured, she pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat. "You never lost him," she said, voice like velvet on glass. "Because he was never yours." They didn't speak in a moment that followed. They didn't have to. The silence said it all. The guests were stunned. Sabrina's face, once photo perfect, cracked with disbelief. And Matthew, he didn't run after her. He didn't explain. He just stood there, still in his suit, as the woman he should have married stood in front of him for the first time, in front of everyone, and said exactly what he never had the courage to. "You never lost him, because he was never yours." Cameras clicked before the shock wore off. Someone in the third row was already live streaming. The strings had stopped playing. No one moved. No one knew what to say, because no one ever expected her to be part of this story. She wasn't the new girlfriend. She wasn't the wife he left for someone younger. She wasn't a scandal with headlines. She was the one they erased. And now, she was standing in their perfect garden wedding, holding his letter. Later, some would say it was theatrical. Some would say it was desperate. But most? They replayed it over and over again online. The clip went viral before she even left the vineyard. Ex-lover crashes billionaire wedding in stunning twist. Matthew Rains walks away from altar mid-ceremony. Anonymous woman reveals long-lost affair at high society wedding. Her name wasn't mentioned at first, but it didn't take long. Someone had tagged her planner's profile in a behind-the-scenes floral post days earlier. From there, it spread like fire. Lila Hart, the one who used to be everything, the one who had disappeared. Now, she was everywhere. By the time she got back to the guest suite, her phone had over 700 missed messages. Some were supportive. Some were vicious. Some just said one thing. Why now? Matthew found her before sunset. She was sitting alone at the edge of the estate's east terrace, legs tucked beneath her, face turned toward the hills. She hadn't cried. Not yet. But her hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stood behind her for a long time before speaking. "They're saying a lot of things," he said finally. "None of them are true." She didn't turn. "Some of them are." A pause. Then, "Why didn't you stop it before today?" she asked, voice like frost. He exhaled slowly. Because I thought I deserved the punishment. And what made you change your mind? You. Too late. I know. She stood and faced him. This close, he looked more human than he ever had in boardrooms or magazines or the carefully curated images his team pushed every quarter. You let them rewrite our story, she said. You let them turn me into a ghost so you could be king. He didn't deny it, because he couldn't. I try to fix it, he said quietly. You try to forget it. And with that, she walked past him. No shouting, no begging, no apology that would ever be enough. Just the silence of a woman who finally remembered she was never the problem. The story didn't fade. Not this time. The clip of her voice, soft, sharp, calm like a blade, had crossed 2 million views by the end of the week. 1,000 versions had already been reposted. Slowed down, remixed with piano music, even turned into a quote graphic with a white background and gold cursive. You never lost him, because he was never yours. People didn't stop watching, because they recognized something in her face that had nothing to do with scandal. It was the look of a woman who'd waited 14 years to say one sentence, and the strength to say it when no one else would. 3 days later, Lila Hart sat in her apartment, barefoot on the edge of her couch, wrapped in the quiet she used to dread, but now welcomed like a second skin. The jasmine candle on the counter flickered low. She hadn't lit it in years. Not since before the silence. Not since before the world made her feel like memory was a weakness. The same scent Matthew once teased her about. Said it smelled like melancholy wrapped in sugar. Maybe it did, but tonight it smelled like something else. Closure. She hadn't spoken to him. Not since the vineyard. Not since the day she stood in front of Sabrina Vale's family empire and pulled the rug out from under their curated legacy with nothing but truth and 4 folded pages of ink. He tried. 2 calls, a voice message, 1 text that said, "When you're ready, I'll still be here." She hadn't responded, not because she hated him, but because she finally understood something. She wasn't the ending to his story. He was a chapter in hers. Her inbox overflowed. Producers, bridal magazines, podcasters who loved the word redemption arc. A publishing house offered her an advance, real money, for a memoir with a working title she didn't even like. Love and Legacy. The planner who walked into a wedding and changed everything. She smiled, then closed the email. She didn't want to relive the past. She wanted to rebuild something better. She opened a fresh document. Blank, unnamed, a new space, like breathing. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, then began to type. Lila Hart, founder. Legacy by design. A firm, not for weddings, not for events, for stories, for women like her, who were made to feel too loud, too late, too inconvenient, for the ones who disappeared in silence and came back with fire in their eyes. Her cursor blinked. She added the tagline, "We don't design events. We rewrite endings." She sat back, closed her eyes, and this time, she didn't feel hollow. She felt whole. Later that night, the city hummed below her window. She poured a glass of wine and let the silence stretch, until her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She didn't flinch. She answered. Lila. Came a voice, familiar, careful, real. It wasn't Matthew. It was her old assistant. "There's someone here to see you." Says he didn't come with flowers or apologies. Just something he found. Who? The older man. From the vineyard. The one who gave you the memo. Said he has something else. Your real contract. The one Vale Group buried. Her breath caught. Slowly, she stood and walked to the door. "Send him up," she said. "Are you sure?" "Yes. This time, I signed first." And that was how it ended. Not with a kiss. Not with a ring. But with her name in ink. Exactly where it always belonged.